Okay, the next section of part 3 of Atonement is only quite short, but is particularly significant. And there's two things that happen really. Firstly, we see the letter that Bryony is sent by an editor after she sent off a short story. And this short story that she sent off is basically what turns into Atonement. It's a story of a girl seeing these two people by the fountain with the vase. And the second reason that this section is important is that then Bryony goes to Lola and Paul Marshall's wedding. Okay, so we start at the top of page 311, and Luke Cornett has just died, and we're told that Bryony is walking with Fiona, and right at the top of the page we're told that it seemed as though they were resuming, after a lifetime of experience, their walk across Westminster Bridge. So another mention of a bridge. Again, at a turning point, Bryony has just seen Luke Cornett die, particularly significant in terms of this total loss of innocence and this destruction of innocence by the war. And then she gets this letter, which sort of reawakens her childhood desire to write and her interest in it. And the letter starts about 3/4 of the way down page 311. I think this letter is important for a few reasons. Firstly, it's signed CC. Now, there was a real editor called Cyril Connolly, who worked for various literary magazines. So McEwan is again deliberately blurring the line between fiction and reality. He doesn't want us to look at some bits of this story and say, oh, that bit's false and that bit's true. He's deliberately making it a slightly more muddy water than that. Secondly, it's important because we recognise in this letter that the story that Bryony has sent off is basically very, very similar to Atonement, and we realise obviously at the end that what she sent off is sort of a first draft of Atonement, and we're only reading the final draft now. And thirdly, it's important because it carries on that postmodern style. This is a part of Atonement that is about writing itself, and we see that in the letter. So Cyril Connolly gives us the feedback, which starts on page 311. When we get onto page 312, about a third of the way down, he tells her there are some good images. I liked the long grass stalked by the leonine yellow of high summer. Significant because that's something that actually is mentioned in part 1. Okay, that word leonine and the description is there. So there are these things in part 1 that actually we're recognising in this letter. He continues about halfway down page 312. However, we wondered whether it owed a little too much to the techniques of Mrs. Woolf. Now, Mrs. Woolf is Virginia Woolf, who was a feminist writer but also a modernist writer, so writing in the 20th century. And she experimented a lot with stream of consciousness. So her writing style was, I guess, broadly speaking, a little bit like part 2 of Atonement. And what Cyril Connolly is saying to Bryony is you're copying it too much. You need a plot. You need to sort of go back to that earlier style of writing a little bit. So actually what we get there again is the literary style of Atonement matching the context of the time. Bryony returning to childhood and also returning to a more old-fashioned style of storytelling. As it continues, about 3/4 of the way down the page, he says, put the other way around, our attention would have been held even more effectively had there been an underlying pull of simple narrative. So he's saying to her, yes, these modern techniques are exciting and interesting, but go back and put a story in. And that's why I think the story develops in the way it does. Part 1 of Atonement is an old-fashioned story, really, isn't it? Part 2 has the stream of consciousness, and now part 3 is writing about writing. It's postmodern. We see on the top of page 313, he says it's nice that we know that this girl is writing stories and folktales and plays, and he puts in brackets, how much nicer if we had the flavour of one. Again, we're recognising, aren't we, because in part 1 there was the trials of Arabella. So all of this stuff in the letter actually ends up happening in part 1. As he continues, about a third of the way down page 313, he says, wouldn't it help you if the watching girl did not actually realise that the vase had broken? Okay, now again, part 1, that's exactly what happens. Bryony doesn't even know the vase is involved. So we're getting the feeling here that what is in part 3 here, in this letter, has actually gone and influenced what happens in part 1. And we find it at the end that that's because what we read in part 1 of Atonement is the finished version, the final draft. As it continues, about 2/3 of the way down page 313, he says, if this girl had so fully misunderstood or been so wholly baffled by the strange little scene that has unfolded before her, how might it affect the lives of the two adults? Again, that's exactly what Atonement is about. He continues, might she innocently expose them somehow to the young woman's parents? Perhaps they surely would not approve of a liaison between their eldest daughter and their child lady's son. So again, Cyril Connolly's sort of ironically spotting all the things that actually did happen to Bryony. But he's putting them alongside these very classic literary tropes and literary techniques, isn't he? There's a richer family, and then there's a boyfriend who they disapprove of, or a partner who they disapprove of, and he's putting all these things from Bryony's story that she was desperate to write alongside these classic bits of literature, which is ironically exactly what Bryony was trying to do. He tells us about 5 lines down, page 314, the readers retain a childlike desire to be told a story. Anytime you see the word childlike, it's important, but here in particular it stands out. Who is he saying he's childlike here? It's the readers. He's saying as readers, we are like children. We want a nice story. And so we're in on it here, aren't we? We're in on the fake ending that Bryony gives us. And that's the point. It's not as simple as the realities that that Robbie and Cecilia died and the stories that they lived. The whole point here is that this is a novel. And as Cyril Connolly says here, as Bryony knows, readers expect and want certain things. And just like how in Trials of Arabella, there's the happy ending, Bryony accepts that although that might not be reality, that's what readers want, and so in a story, that's what has to happen. Right at the bottom of page 314, he says, as you will see, we do not believe that artists have an obligation to strike up attitudes to war. So he's making the comment really there that the war and the narrative don't have to sort of be referenced within each other, they can be totally separate. Again, slightly ironic, because I think the whole point of Atonement is that Bryony's guilt echoes the horrors of the war. And then obviously it's signed CC, so that, you know, is Cyril Connolly. So then as it continues, Bryony then sort of decides to pay Paul Marshall and Lola a visit. And we're told on page 316, about 3/4 of the way down, this brightness, this long spell of sunny days, was history's last fling before another stretch of time began. Again, very much like part 1, isn't it? The heat and the sense that something's coming to an end and something new is about to start. And so I think this is part of that hint that we're sort of going back to the start again. Bryony's returning to Paul Marshall, and then in a bit she returns to Robbie and Cecilia. And there's that idea again that this is a bit of a circular narrative. Something is coming to an end and something's beginning, just like at part 1. And we're sort of going back to the start again. Bryony's going back to the story, putting in the happy ending that Cyril Connolly's just told her that readers want. She goes, so on page 318, she goes to this church. So on Saturday morning, Bryony left the hospital at 8 without eating breakfast and walked with the river on a right upstream. As she passed the gate of Lambeth Palace, 3 buses went by. All the destination boards were blank now, confusion to the invader. So again, we see the war and the story side by side. There's confusion because basically during the Blitz, Britain was sort of semi-expecting a Nazi invasion. So they would, you know, black out the boards on the buses, so it would be hard for people to find their way around. But again, in terms of the story, we're starting to enter some really murky waters here, aren't we? Because we're getting to the point of things that don't really happen. And so actually, again, the context is echoing what Bryony's doing as an author. Top of page 319, as she walked against the flow of morning traffic, she ran through the nursery rhyme she remembered. So again, the innocence is being returned to. Bryony's trying to put it right. Bryony's going back to the start. Okay, we think at the moment it's because she's going to put it all right. We find out at the end it's because she's going to give us the happy ending that she wants the story to have. Page 319, right at the bottom, she was walking under the bridge. So again, there's a bridge, there's a turning point. She's going to see Lola and Paul Marshall. She's reflecting on what Cyril Connolly told her on page 320, that all those questions he asked, might the girl have come between them in some disastrous fashion, is exactly what happened. And so she's realising that as readers, there's certain types of story that we're always looking for, and now she needs to give us the happy ending. We're told about 3/4 of the way down, did she really think she could hide behind some borrowed notions of modern writing and drown her guilt in a stream, 3 streams of consciousness? Okay, so again, that writing style is referred to there. That's where Bryony's hiding. But now she needs to go back to the story. Okay, she needs a plot. She needs to return to innocence, just like in the Trials of Arabella. As we go on to page 321, right at the bottom, we've got the reference to the children having to leave. And there's that, again, there's that sign that Bryony's totally out of that bubble from part 1. In part 1, the Talises exist in a bubble separate to the world. Here, the kids are described as jug-eared, they're kicking, they're screaming. She says, leave off, will ya, let the nursie through. There's that clear sort of blurring of class distinctions that we had so clearly at the start. Bottom of page 322, she's going to this wedding, and we're told that Bryony had been imagining the scene of a crime, a Gothic cathedral. So again, she's relying on these classic literary symbols, a Gothic cathedral, the scene of a crime, and that's not what happens. So just like in Northanger Abbey, the book that's referenced, We don't always get these sort of gothic tales that we might expect. The top of page 324, we're told that Lola is heavily veiled right at the top. So again, there's the idea, on the one hand she's childlike, she's all in white, so she's innocent. On the other hand, she's veiled, she's hidden. And that's the symbol that's always been used for Lola, isn't she? She's a contradiction. She's an innocent victim, but she's also somebody who's in disguise, who's willingly going along with this. And we're told that, again, halfway down page 324, Lola is barely more than a child, prized open and taken, but then marries a rapist. She's both victim and sort of guilty as well. And then we are told that the priest gets to that point where they say, you know, anybody who has a reason why they can't get married, come forward. And then we have this section where we're asked, was it really happening? Was Bryony standing up? And again, there's that sense of that's what should happen. At that moment in the wedding, somebody should get up and say, no, I object. But obviously that's not what ends up happening. So again, just like in the end with the trials of Arabella, there's Bryony aware of what should happen in the ideal story and following along with that and playing along, but also aware that that's not true. And we're told about a third of the way down page 325, the sentence had already been served, the debt was paid, the verdict stood. Those very short, simple sentences again. We know what should happen in a story, but Bryony's aware that we don't get it. And it's only then in that next section that's just come in where Bryony gives us what we want, gives Sybil Connolly what we want, that childlike narrative, that happy ending, just like in Trials of Arabella. But she's realising now, I think here, that it's only through a story that she can do that. It's only through a story that she can return to innocence.